Good afternoon. Thank you very much for attending today. Just wait a few more minutes whilst a few more people log on. As you can see, we are in Singapore from the backdrop behind me. Okay. Thank you very much for attending today. My name is Andrew Talbot, and I work for GlobalEye, and I run a website called expatfinancialplanning.com, which is up in the top left-hand corner. We're live from Singapore today, as you can see behind. It's a nice sunny day, and today is part of our sort of live webinar masterclass, which is a series of these we've done throughout the year on different subjects, and normally over lunchtime. And today it's on estate planning, so how to pass on assets to your children and create a legacy. If you're looking through this through the Zoom software, you can ask some questions. And if you're live on YouTube or you're watching it through there, then you might just have to email me later if you have some questions, or Twitter, or through Facebook, or through the website. Lots of different mediums to get in contact with. You could actually just phone us as well. Estate planning and how to pass on assets to your children and create a legacy. What is estate planning? Well, there's normally three different parts that we talk about when we do financial planning: why, how, and where. And the three components that sometimes they get mixed up, and depending on who you get advice from, they may concentrate on one particular component. So if you go to a private bank or a financial advisor or insurance agents, it depends on what they're looking to give you advice on. The why is really what we're going to talk about today, and that is goals, financial planning, estate planning, the reasons why you're doing things. The how we will touch on to a certain extent, but it's the vehicles, it's the process, the pieces of paper, the tax efficient wrappers that allow you to do what you want to do. The where would be funds, it will be investments, equities, bonds, and they are all different, and you can't really have one without the other to a certain extent. You can always have the why. So estate planning, what is estate planning? Really, it's passing on assets to the next generation, or to the beneficiaries, your named beneficiaries, your spouse, your family, and it's to do it in quick and easy, and to avoid or lower any potential tax. And that is really what we're trying to achieve with today's webinar, is to show you how to do it, some of the tools that we can use to do that, and how easy it is. Because it sounds complicated at first, and some people might need complex estate plans, but often it is very, very simple, and some really simple pieces of paper in the right place at the right time can solve a lot of problems for your beneficiaries, and it may help you with your parents or your grandparents or aunties and uncles to understand some of these techniques and some of the things that you can use. Really, with the estate planning and the complexity, we really just want to serve two overall goals. First one is to specify where the estate is divided, who's going to get what, and to do it as quickly and as easily and as low cost in terms of tax and fees as possible. And the other one is really to think about children, especially if you've got minors, the implication of them having enough assets that they can continue with their lives in what would be a very traumatic and stressful situation. So what are some of the issues and concerns to think about? Well, depending on which location you are resident, and depending on what your nationality are and your religious status, will depend on whether or not you have particular issues or concerns with it in regards to estate planning. The big one that normally happens is forced heirship. So some countries will force you to pass on assets to certain family members, regardless of your relationship with them. So certainly under some Muslim or under the Sharia law, there are forced heirship rules in place. This may not suit or be what your wishes are. So there are ways to get around this, or to avoid it, or to follow your wishes. You also have to go through probate, and probate is dividing the asset up, looking at whether there are liabilities, paying those liabilities, going through the forced heirship issues, and really passing on those assets to that next generation. There may be different tax laws depending on which country you're in, and also different tax processes and different taxes. So depending on where the asset is held, or depending on what process or what tax will be applicable to that particular position or that particular asset. But the main thing is cost and time. In such a traumatic position that you'll probably find yourself in, the death of a person is very, very stressful. And if the assets can be passed to who needs them as quickly and as cost efficient as possible, then that is really one of the big aims out of doing some estate planning. Some of the other issues to think about, language and dealing with paperwork. Certainly as an expat, you'll have assets and currencies and different languages for different assets. You're living overseas, you're living outside your home country. You may have rules that's applicable to your home country, but that are worldwide. And then you also have rules that are applicable to the country that you're living in, or you may even be a third country with a different spouse's nationality, or you've got an asset in a different country. So it's very important to understand what these implications and what the issues are. Where do you start? The easiest place to start is to list all assets and liabilities. Put a column to say who owns what. So is it which spouse owns it? Is it children? Is it grandparents? Is it a fiduciary company? Who owns what? And where the country location is, or where the asset is held. And then you can start to apply the local laws that are applicable to that particular asset. So is there a foreship problem in one particular country because you own a property there, for instance? What are the local probate rules? Is it a worldwide tax, or is it just a local tax? Because that's important to understand whether or not you need to raise money to pay for those taxes. You don't particularly want to be selling assets in order to pay death duties, because normally what happens there is the estate just gets divided up. So there's ways to try and avoid that, the implications of paying tax. Now here's a link to Ernst & Young, and they have a tax guide, estate and inheritance tax. It's on my expatfinancialplanning.com, so you can see it on there. But it will detail you all of the different estate and inheritance taxes for a particular country. So if you've got a property in Bali, for instance, you can say, well, what's the local rules for there? If you have a property in Thailand or Malaysia or the US or Australia, or even here in Singapore, what are the local rules for that? So it's a very good resource to immediately go to. And then we're looking at, well, how do we solve this problem? What tools can we use to do that? So if you think of estate planning as the part in the middle, what do we use around it? So we use a will, use the lasting power of attorney, guardianship forms, will substitutes, trusts, and insurance. And there's a few others as well, but we'll concentrate on these 5 areas today, just to keep the webinar brief and informative. So if we start with the will, you should hold a will for every asset that you have in a jurisdiction. So if you have a property in one country, you should have a will for that. If you have assets in another country, then you should probably have a will for that. Remember that you will go through probate on this. It will be the deceased wishes, and that's what you use a will for. But there is a time and there is a cost to it. Certainly going through probate will add to the time and the cost problems. And sometimes going through probate, certainly in different countries, can take 2 years to go through. Certainly some of the cases recently have dealt with it's been a minimum of 6 months just to get through that probate. So you want to pass assets on as quickly as possible, and people want to move on with their lives. Having to deal with administration in a third country can be very tiring and stressful. Lasting power of attorney normally comes along with the will. It's normally part of it. And it's someone who manages your affairs if in the case of illness or incapacity. So if you are suffering dementia and you're unable to remember where your assets are, you can't log on to the internet banking, you can't access those assets in order to your daily requirements. Maybe you need to start paying for healthcare cover, long-term care, nursing homes, everything else that goes with that. So it's important just to see what it is. I think we've just got a question come through. So let's just ask that. The question comes in: can I be tax efficient if I return back to the UK without passing inheritance to my children? What is the tax band? Now, I'll just quickly answer that question. That would be the tax band in the UK is 325 grand, and you can pass assets on to your children whilst you're in the UK or whilst you're overseas. It really is depending on what type of tool or what type of vehicle you use to do that. But people often say inheritance tax is very much a voluntary tax. So if you get in contact, we'll show you the ways to do it, and you might even learn some of the ways on here. So if we go back to the lasting power of attorney, what you don't want is your assets to be frozen. You want to be able to access them as quickly as possible, and you want to pass them on to your kids or anyone who you will need, your dependents, for instance. Now, this might apply to your parents or grandparents, where if they're into retirement ages or into their later years, you want to be able to make sure that they can still pay for their ongoing daily needs. So it's important to have a lasting power of attorney. Now, guardianship, again, it will probably come with a will, and it probably come with the LPA, the lasting power of attorney. And it's normally just a legal letter, certainly the temporary legal letter. And for, say, here in Singapore, it just gives someone the ability to look after your children if you're not there. The permanent guardian is normally in your will. So hence the two different examples. There is a guardianship letter on that website, a temporary guardianship letter, so you can download that. Now, if we go on some of the main points, it's really an event of both parents passing at the same time, and you want someone to look after your kids until your permanent guardians, your parents, their grandparents will turn up. It works in most civil code countries. But without this letter, the children will get looked after by the local authorities. In reality, they want people to come and take the kids out of their care and look after them. So it's not quite as draconian as it sometimes gets described as. There is a court of protection, certainly here in Singapore, which has the ultimate say over the guardianships. But as I said, it's very unlikely that they will go against the guardianship letter. And most people will name a friend in Singapore as this temporary guardianship. You can't name a helper, which is really what most people would like to do, because she will lose her legal rights in the country. So the foreign domestic worker, although that's sometimes the best person, unfortunately you can't name them. And it's always worth having a pack of documents, birth certificates, passports, which most people do anyway. And in this, you have the letters of guardianship. So if we come on to will substitutes, let's look at these. One of the parts of an estate planning is to remove assets from a will, because as we said before, it has to go through probate. There's a time, there's a cost. And we want to be as efficient as possible. We want to get assets to the kids, we want to get to the spouses, we want to be able to avoid having to pay for solicitor or lawyer fees. So will substitute is a very good way of doing that. Very quick and administratively easy, very easy to amend, and obviously it follows the wishes of the deceased. And you can avoid some of the issues we talked about before, probate and forced heirship. Some examples of this: joint tenancy on property. This is a great example. You have an owner of a property in one location, one spouse. If you add the other spouse to it as a joint tenancy, it automatically gets passed over. So you don't need to go through probate because that joint tenancy happens. Sometimes property will get set up as a tenancy in common, which means that the assets will be passed to the estate rather than to the other owner. It depends on how you set it up. The other example is a nomination of beneficiaries on life insurance. So if you set up a life insurance policy and there's no beneficiaries, if something happens to that person, then the life insurance will get paid into the estate, where therefore you have to go through probate. There might be tax now on that bigger estate because you've added more assets into it. So by adding a nomination of beneficiaries, you can supersede that. So if you name the spouse or children, then it will get paid to those people, so you can get paid to your spouse's bank account very, very quickly. Within a month, normally, on the life insurance, all you're doing is handing over the death certificate and the claim form at that point. And it's a much quicker way of getting the assets to the beneficiaries, because at that point, they probably need it. Now, trusts. These can be very complicated, and they've been used for hundreds of years in order to pass on assets between generations and down through the bloodline. Very confidential, very tax efficient, great for protection. And I'll come on to some of the tax types of trusts there. But really what you're doing is you're passing assets to a fiduciary, a trust company, and there are different components to this trust. Normally a settler, which would be the person who's passing the assets onto it. And you have trustees who could be you, it could be a company, it could be family members, and then you've got the beneficiaries. And there's a few other components in there as well, but the beneficiaries are the people who are entitled to that trust. There are different types, and they can be useful in some circumstances, and they can be quite complicated, and they can compound the problem if you use the wrong trust. When I mentioned that they're tax efficient, they are tax efficient, but you've got to follow the rules in order to generally make them tax efficiency and set them up in the right way. Otherwise, they can become tax liable. Some countries won't recognize them. So you have to use, say, a company. That's another way of doing it, or a foundation. But we can discuss that at a later date. So if I look at these types of trusts, there's lots of different ones, and I'll just bring them up on the screen there. But I'll comb in on a couple of them. So if we look at one, which would be the bare and absolute trust, which we've just got the mouse over there, that is a trust that you can't change the beneficiaries on. So you'll set up a trust, you put the assets into it, and then that's it. You can't change it. So that is an example that of using a trust that might work in some circumstances. If you wanted to use another one, another particular trust, for instance, a discretionary trust, you can change the beneficiaries on there. So you may find that that's a better way of passing on assets because you might have more children, for instance. Other trusts that we use are will trusts. And you may have this already, you just didn't realize it, that when you set up a will, the money will be passed instead of to an estate. You might say, well, it goes into trust for the beneficiaries of your children. And you can do that by creating a will. And if you have a pension scheme, then you might be able to use that may be a trust as well. So you really got to look at what type of trust it is and where do you want to use it. But they are very, very useful. The last part of those 5 components was insurance, and you use insurance really to sometimes create this legacy. There's normally 2 types: whole of life and term. Term is obviously a set period, and you may use this if your children are 10, but they're going to be at university, finish university at 23, so they're not going to be dependent on you. But during that period, something happens to you, then you want to be able to provide for them. So you just set up a 10-year or a 13-year term policy for an amount. Whole of life is, as it says, the whole of your life. And this is where sometimes we create legacy or we use it to pay taxes. So depending on which one you want to set up will depend on what you're trying to achieve with the estate planning. Set it up correctly, use a trust. You want the assets to go to a trust or to a beneficiary. So make sure you use it, set it up properly. If you're trying to use a legacy, if you're trying to use the whole of life to create a large lump sum on your death without using your existing assets or without having to give away your assets, then insurance can be that. So you can just build up this insurance policy for that. And it depends on what you're trying to achieve. And obviously you're trying to provide for the family and pay for the inheritance tax if there is any. Paying for the family because you are no longer there, or maybe you're the breadwinner, and if something happens to that person, then the family's going to have to leave their country or they're going to have to sell assets. Insurance can sometimes provide that solution to not having to sell those assets. Certainly if you've got dependents, it is always worth having an insurance policy. And then it's really a case of what you want to do with your estate planning. So if we do in summary, identify the problems first. Goes back to that initial list. Where is the asset held? Is there a local issue? Is there a forced heirship problem that will exist with it? And how can you pass on those assets? Start the process. You may need to use a will substitute. You may need to do a will. You may just need to set up some insurance because it's quite simple, or it could get to a point where it's getting a little bit more complicated and you need a trust, you need an offshore company in order to hold those assets, and get advice. It is a very, very complicated subject. If you really need to go into more of those components, you would need advice to set up a will. So go to a solicitor. So at some point you will need to do it. Ask about your insurance policy. Add a nomination of beneficiary on there if needs be. But certainly get advice. So that's me. Go to the website Expat Financial Planning, and you can. There's a lot more information on there. Obviously, this is still on YouTube, so go to the channel, the Expat Financial Planning YouTube channel, and you're able to see some more videos about some of the other webinars that we've done this year. Yeah, get in contact. Thank you very much.